Today's Saturday, the 8th of February 2025, and welcome to the new Australia. If you live in Australia or you're visiting the country, you now live in a society where speech is criminalised. Following the passing of this hate speech bill, rushed through Parliament last week and given royal assent in record time, you can now go to jail for up to 7 years in Australia if you engage in political speech that offends some groups. This is a very dark day in our history. To think that in this country, in 2025 and going forward, that you can actually go to jail for your political opinions is a day I thought that I would never see happen in my country. I'll tell you for one thing for sure, I'm running for the Libertarians here in New South Wales in the Senate. And if I'm successful, the very first order of business, on the very first day, I'll be putting in legislation to repeal the so-called hate crimes bill in its entirety, because it is a violation of our fundamental rights of freedom of speech, and most of all, it is even counterproductive of the goals it is trying to achieve. The bill is nothing other than a Trojan horse to sneak provisions into the law to suppress freedom of speech and to promote these globalist causes. Now, firstly, there's the absolute disgrace we saw in the federal parliament, where the Liberal Party, supposed to be the guardians of freedom in the political spectrum, sided with Labor and the Greens to rush this bill through the Senate. They simply knew they'd learned from the mis and disinformation bill, where that mis and disinformation bill, there was able to be several weeks of public debate about it, and were able to change, the public were able to see what the bill was about, to lobby their representatives, their elected representatives, who then changed their mind in the parliament and were able to defeat that bill. That is how democracy should work. The democracy should not work where this type of legislation is rushed through with debate guillotined, pushed through by both the Liberal Party, the Labor Party and the Greens. But that is exactly what happens. And here is this historic photo that will go down a day that will live in infamy in our country when Liberals and Greens combined and joined hands to pass this bill through the Parliament. And the tragedy was that the Liberal Party, if they had have stood solid on this, with the very brave Senator Alex Antics from the Liberal Party crossing the floor, Gerard Rennick also voting against it, and Senator Ralph Babet voting against it, and a couple of other senators, there was enough numbers to defeat this legislation on the floor of the Parliament. But it was the weakness, the cowardness of the Liberal Party that enabled this legislation to go through. So we now live in a society where if you're engaging in political debate on contemporary political issues, you have to be very careful about what you say. Because if you cross the line, and that line is very vague as to where it is, if you cross the line, you can end up seeing yourself arrested and spending up to 7 years in jail under this new legislation. So the uncertainty of the legislation, the ambiguity of it, is itself a deterrent to free speech. People are going to err on the side of caution. Who wants to spend 7 years in jail and be dragged through the courts for something, a political statement that you said? So the legislation itself becomes a deterrent to free speech, in addition to the provisions of the legislation. And let's just go through some of those provisions in this legislation. Now, firstly, an important point is we already have laws in this country that prohibit inciting violence or threatening violence. Those laws exist. I know myself, in the 2019 election campaign, the Greens candidates made a complaint that I threatened violence against them. The circumstances were a Green candidate dressed up in a dinosaur suit snuck up behind me, caught me by surprise, and I politely turned around and reminded him that it may not be good for his health if he does engage in such an activity. He then went straight to the police, reported me for threatening violence against them, which of course was completely untrue. But that was an example of the laws that already exist in this country. Now, these laws simply extend the provisions and act as a Trojan horse to bring in other much harsher provisions. So again, let's just go through the provisions of the legislation. Now, there's two separate sections. One is they call it threatening force or violence against groups, and the other section is threatening force or violence against members of groups or close associates. They're both effectively the same thing, whether it's a group itself or a member of a group. Now, the first important provision of this legislation, it's not just about threatening violence. They've included in the wording of the legislation threatening force or violence. Now, here's the thing is, violence is physical force used to cause injury or harm to someone. But including the words threatening force lowers the threshold substantially, because threatening force doesn't actually have to include physical harm. Threatening force, as the dictionary reminds us, can be to influence, to compel, not just by physical activities, but by moral and intellectual means. So here, by including threatening force in addition to violence, it lowers the threshold about the type of speech that it could find in violation of the Act. Secondly, the most disturbing thing is that what they call here the targeted groups. Now, okay, we can have an argument about targeting people by race, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, national ethnic origin. But this legislation goes further. It actually includes political opinion. So under this legislation, a so-called targeted group that gets special protection is a group that holds a political opinion. This is interfering in political free discourse, in political speech. Such legislation would never be allowed or never be permitted under the US First Amendment that protects free speech. That's why one of the reasons, as the Libertarian Party, our policy is to amend the Constitution via referendum, that we insert the provisions, a similar provision to the US First Amendment, to make it unconstitutional for a government to bring in laws to try and restrict free political speech. In fact, this is exactly what this bill does. And you see there the third provision, a reasonable member of the targeted group would fear. Well, that's a very low threshold. And the threat, if carried out, would threaten the peace, order and good government of Australia. How long is a piece of string when you're trying to determine what that actually means? So let's give an example of these new laws about how they could work in practice. And let's look at a speech of Sir Robert Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party. Now, here's an old newspaper clipping from the 1950s, early 1950s. And it says here, nearly 4,000 people cheered wildly at Herstal tonight, where Mr. R.G. Menzies, the opposition leader, said, and I quote, "We are going to declare war on the communists and we're going to give them a thrashing." Now, look at Sir Robert Menzies' words and compare them to the current legislation. Sir Robert Menzies used the words that he's going to give them a thrashing. Now, that falls within the definition of a threat of use of force, whether it's actually physical, intellectual, or moral. To say you're going to give someone a thrashing, a colloquial Australian expression, that ticks the box that becomes a threat to use of force. So that's one of the ticks that you could find yourself arrested for. Secondly, is he targeting a group distinguished by political opinion? And yes, he's targeting the communists. The communists are a group distinguished by political opinion. So targeting the communists brings him in within violation of this act. And a member of the communists might fear that this might happen. Well, that could certainly happen. And with the leftist infiltration we've seen in our courts, it's highly likely that they would interpret Sir Robert Menzies' comments as, if carried out, would threaten the peace and good order of government of Australia. And here's the other changes that they made in this legislation. It no longer matters if Sir Robert Menzies would have made that speech in good faith or if he didn't mean violence. That threshold is gone. The argument is now that he said it recklessly and therefore he would be in violation of that act and could face up to 7 years in jail. So to my Liberal Party friends out there, my ex-Liberal Party friends and colleagues out there, do you realise that you have just voted for legislation that is going to make it illegal in this country with a 7-year jail penalty, if I quote Sir Robert Menzies? He would be rolling in his grave if he knew this is what the Liberal Party of 2025 had posted. So what are we going to do? We're going to declare Sir Robert Menzies a person that engaged in hate speech? Are we going to take his statue down on Lake Burley Griffin? Or perhaps we'll have to burn also Robert Menzies' books here, The Forgotten People, because we know that under today's definition, Sir Robert Menzies engaged in terrible hate speech and hate crimes and would have been arrested under the provisions. If he made those same statements today, he would be arrested under the provisions of this act that the Liberal Party has voted for. And then there is the mandatory jail provisions of this act. This act takes away the discretion of the courts for certain offences. That the courts can no longer determine, well, it was an innocent technical breach and therefore we'll give you a suspended sentence or we'll let you off with a fine or a warning. No. Under this act, if you are found guilty of certain offences, that discretion is taken away from the courts and you are given a mandatory jail sentence under this act. So here we have the Labor Party and the Greens that have argued that as long as I could remember against mandatory sentencing for any reason, for any excuse, now supporting mandatory sentencing for speech. How far we have fallen as a free nation. Then there's the provision in this legislation that makes it an offence depending on where you put your arms. So if you're speaking and you like to move your arms around when you talk, be very careful about what hand signals you give.
This one really mattered. And I just want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you. My heart goes out to you. It is thanks to you that the future of civilization is assured.
If you're out on the streets hailing a taxi, be very careful about how you do that, because you could be easily photographed and say, oh, look, a Nazi salute. And that, for that, my friends, is a compulsory 12 months in jail. Again, with no discretion from the courts. Mad legislation. What such legislation does, anyone that gives a Nazi salute in public should be laughed at. They should be mocked. They should be ridiculed. But by having a law that actually criminalises it and potentially puts someone in jail, you're going to make a martyr or a hero out of some idiot that does a Nazi salute in the streets, and he's going to gain sympathy from that. And finally, none of us want to see a society with this so-called hate speech. But the best way, as history has shown, to defeat hate speech is not with censorship, but with free and open debate. There's a great book that I could recommend to everyone. It's titled Hate Speech, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech and Not Censorship, by Nadine Strossen, a former president of the US American Civil Libertarians Society. And that is what she argues. She argues that the best way to address hateful or unpleasant speech is with more speech, principled debate, whereby all speakers and listeners can become better informed. Where we ban someone, we ban one type of speech, political speech, it has always been counterproductive throughout history. And as RFK Jr. correctly argues, those on the side of censorship have always been on the wrong side of history. To my Liberal Party friends, you are on the wrong side of history on this. And that's why I'm very pleased to be running as the Libertarian candidate here in New South Wales. And as I said earlier, if we are successful at this next election, on day one of that new parliament, I'll be introducing legislation to repeal this so-called hate speech laws in full. And I'll be further moving to introduce a referendum at the subsequent election to enshrine in our Constitution a similar provision to the US First Amendment that protects free speech, to ensure that such legislation as this has been rammed through our parliament, would be deemed unconstitutional and simply be void. Our politicians have shown us over the last several years that they cannot be trusted when it comes to protecting freedom of speech, and that should be enshrined in our Constitution.